Well, good morning, everyone. My name's John Mayo. I'm a professor here at FSU in the College of Social Sciences and a longtime participant with my colleagues this morning in the South Asian Media and Cultural Studies Conference. As many of you know, this is our 7th iteration of this wonderful conference, but this is the first time we've gone completely virtual. So it's a bit of a voyage of discovery, but so far so good. We had a wonderful keynote speech earlier this morning. So those of you who were here for that, welcome back. Those of you who are joining, a special welcome to you. We begin our first panel this morning, which is entitled Journalism Beyond Borders. It will run from 10:15 to 11:30. And those of you who are viewing via YouTube live stream, please feel free to drop questions into the chat feature at any time. We will compile them and ask as many questions as possible to our panelists during the question and answer period. Our panel leader, an FSU graduate, Dr. Awais Salam, will invite each person to speak, after which he will run a Q&A with the panelists. Please remember that if you are not speaking, please silence mute your microphone. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our panel leader, Dr. Awais Salam. He's from Lamar University, professor of communication and media, Lamar University in Beaumont, Texas. Awais, welcome and thank you for being here this morning. I think you're muted.
Yeah, I'm muted. Let me unmute myself. Okay, thank you, Dr. Mayo. Always a pleasure to be back, although virtually this time. So as you said, our panel is titled Journalism Beyond Borders. It will be myself, Raza Rumi, who is director of the Park Center for Independent Media at Ithaca College. He wears quite a few hats, and the most distinguished of that is as a journalist these days. He has been a civil servant, and he is also a prominent liberal voice, and he also is championing the cause of alternative media in Pakistan these days, and Nyador, an organization that he is a kind of not only founded, but is also running it successfully. And we also have Dr. Kailash Kaushik, who is also an FSU graduate and is now a professor of journalism at Christ University in Bangalore, India. So as you can see from our panel, most of what we will discuss will be related to what journalism is in South Asia, what are the conditions, and we will try to give you some specifics and some overview as well. So who wants to go first, Raza or Kailash?
I think Raza can go.
Maybe Kailash, you take the lead. We'll follow you.
Okay, certainly. I shall do so then. Thank you, Awais. Thank you so much. It's great to be back. It's always good to participate in SAMCS. It's been a while since I've presented here, and especially this time being part of a panel that too with Awais and Raza, it's going to be really interesting. What I'll be doing is, let me just share my screen. Is a very short presentation. I think I have about 7 to 8 minutes. Awais, please do let me know if you can see the presentation.
Yes, we can see that.
Okay. So this is a recent research which I've been doing. Pardon the pun, but I had to include that. But I'm doing a qualitative study on the working conditions of Dalit journalists in India. And I will be talking a bit about caste and the importance of caste, especially at a time where we are having a conference which is themed beyond borders. We're coming from South Asia, and through my research, I have come to know that research in and around journalism practice and journalism in general, caste and the question of caste is something which is very relevant, not just to India as a country, but South Asia as a whole. To just draw some perspective and some context, in the past year or so, we have actually seen two major books, one by Isabella Wilkinson, titled Caste, and Suraj Yangde, who wrote Caste Matters, come out and create a lot of conversations around it. And especially Wilkinson's book Caste, tries to tie up not just the origins of it, be it in India, but a general theme going around racism and the anti-Semitism which existed in Germany. And I think if we have heard the keynote speaker when Dr. Ikat said that the South Asian diaspora certainly has an effect on all of the lives around the world, that would automatically mean that even caste has had an effect on some of your worlds. Now, I'm focusing on journalism and journalists purely because of a couple of things. The first one certainly being this one, during my interview, one of the newspaper journalists certainly did say that the journalists talk about problems faced world over, but there's hardly any space to express their own problems. And that's something which is, I think, global solidarity is truly required to solve that problem. But my research started with this Oxfam report, which came out by the end of 2019, which surveyed newsrooms across India and found that out of the 121 newsrooms that they surveyed, which included both television and print and online newsrooms, 106 were occupied by upper castes, and there were hardly any scheduled castes or scheduled tribes, who belonged to the Dalit community. 3 out of the 4 anchors were upper castes. Any anchor of marginalized caste was absent. Over 70% of the panelists who were invited to the show, TV shows, belonged to upper castes. And if you look at the newspapers, only about 5% of articles in the English newspapers and hardly 10% in the Hindi newspapers were written by marginalized class. And remember, they did not look much into regional media also, which also would certainly reflect a very similar structure. I will not go into much into the theoretical background, but I would want to talk about the working conditions of journalists in India as a whole. Interestingly, India did have, and I am very sad to say that it's in the past, the Working Journalist Act of 1955, which actually was a tripartite system where the government, the owners of media organizations, and the journalists union would come together to decide on the wages which would be given and the general working conditions. And the central government would set up a wage board, and there would be negotiations and prescribed salaries for across the country based on city, and the level of expertise would be decided. Now, this last wage board was in 2007, but from the very introduction of it sometime in 1956, these salaries which have been prescribed have never been given. Every time there's a prescription, the owners take it to court. There's a long legal battle which ensues. The unions react. And by the time a negotiation is settled, it's time for another revision. With this, certainly the inclusion of and the introduction of neoliberal economic policies, you do see a lot of contract journalists, freelancing coming up, and a general precarity around being a journalist in India. They might be doing really good work, but their working conditions are extremely precarious. Certainly an intensification of work and an extension of the working day through an extensive use of social media has also happened. Now, where does caste come in this, right? So my research interest, especially with this, because I've been studying labor for a while, came because although the report from Oxfam did state that hardly there were a few Dalit journalists or journalists from the most marginalized classes, and everything was upper caste, I wanted to know what their working condition is. Now, I want to address, and because it's it is a very important thing to address, that there is an inherent power dynamic here itself. I belong to the uppermost caste in India, and writing about the most marginalized class, whose marginalization I'm pretty sure my life would have added to, is quite a tricky thing. But I will get to that later. A very quick lineup of literature. If you see, these are the only things which have happened. You won't see very hardcore research, but newspaper journalists, other journalists like Kenneth Cooper from the Washington Post, who wrote about it, Robert Jeffrey, who is from Australia, he wrote about it. Every time they wrote about, the media was shocked about the exclusion of Dalits, and most of the time it was written in mainstream media until the Oxfam report, which was one of the more extensive research which we can see. Let me just get straight to it, and then I'll go really quick because I want to address the larger question too. Salary certainly has been a problem for the general conditions of work for journalists across India. The Working Journalist Act, unfortunately, previous in 2020, the central government introduced a revision of labor codes, and with that, all the older labor codes went for a toss, and so did the Working Journalist Act. So technically now that one safety net which did exist, unfortunately hangs in balance, and for most surely it will go off. At the time of promotions and appraisals, there is certainly a lot of caste networks which function, and appraisals do happen through recommendation, and mostly it's between the similar caste networks. There are a lot of journalists who, and this is from the past research and my own interviews with them, conceal their caste identity because the very revealing of the identity of the caste might cause problems at work. And what kind of problems? One is certainly psychological trauma. There is an inherent pressure to work extra to show that they are, they have not come there because of their caste. And this, a kind of very strong perspective that they should not be seen as someone who has used government help to come forward, which is very, very traumatic in itself. They are under a lot of pressure not to do any mistakes or error because it will be blamed on their caste again. A lot of their stories getting rejected was things which were told to me over the interviews. A lot of casteist remarks, especially subliminal casteist remarks, or which keep happening, making the environment itself extremely toxic. And certainly during interviews, very, very strong questions, either directly or sometime in a roundabout way, trying to figure out what caste they are. There is also a problem to the very axis of journalism, although a lot of them join journalism with the motivation to change society. Even in the most prestigious of institutions of journalism in India, including the central government ones, access to journalism is very, very less. You hardly find any Dalit students joining. A recent survey by one of the journalists showed that Asian College of Journalism, which is one of the foremost training institutes, actually gave scholarships, and announced scholarships for Dalit students, but hardly anyone applied. A lot of them also told that in Indian journalism, there's this presence of the godfather where, you go ask them for advice, they suggest, they, recommend you. That absence of the godfather also, affects how many people get into these networks. And the absence of social networks, as I said, matter a lot when it comes to journalism. Now, here's where before I go to this, I also would want to say that Indian journalism also reaches globally. But unfortunately, the kind of journalism which is reaching out globally is still within the perspectives of one particular caste, and most often the upper caste. And I can be sure that most of still is extremely Brahminical. That is the lens which the world also sees Indian journalism in. And if I take back Ashwini Deshpande's dimensions of untouchability, of exclusion, humiliation, and exploitation, I do argue that in the Indian newsroom, untouchability still exists. Untouchability might be banned and made illegal by law, but in the Indian newsrooms, I want to argue that these three things, as I have shown previously, still exist, which means the news which people consume are coming from a toxic environment where untouchability, not in the literal sense, but in the sense of exclusion, humiliation, and exploitation is happening. And the world over, and I'm pretty sure across the borders, even in Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, the question of caste certainly arises. And one thing, especially with the Beyond Borders theme, what I wanted to talk about here is any solidarity across the borders is extremely important to voice out these problems and engage in these discussions, because sometimes these problems cross over. Although there are a committee to protect journalists, there are Reporters Against Borders, but the understanding of caste as one of the base, social constructs which influence journalism should be brought forward and talked about it. In general, while you're talking about the political economy of media, or even while analyzing news practice, I think caste becomes an extremely important, indicator. And not only because of these things which I've talked about, but the general connection it has to other power networks. Now, when I do say this, and some of you might have read the recent Cisco case, where even in the US, there was a court case which was based on caste discrimination. You do understand that these dimensions of untouchability has gone global. And with a lot of more students going out and engaging in journalism across the world, I think this should be something which we as a, not only the South Asian subcontinent, but world over, think about and try to end the caste discrimination and try to fight against caste like a global movement against racism is happening. With that, I think I'll stop. I think I've taken almost 7 to 8 minutes. I can certainly take questions right after. So thank you. Let me stop sharing.
Thank you, Kailash. And with that, we can go to Raza Rumi. Raza, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I don't know what's happening with my video, but let me fix it. So, yeah, thank you so
There you are.
much, Dr. Awais Salim, and Kailash's presentation was fascinating, especially with the kind of materials he has employed. So I'm going to basically do a far broader overview, and unlike my erudite predecessor, I haven't undertaken any original research on what I'm going to speak about, but I think I want to focus basically on how the the decline in democratic freedoms and democracies in South Asia are directly both a result of the shrinking spaces for media outlets and journalists, and vice versa. So it's a pretty symbiotic process which is underway. And if we were to look at the major countries in South Asia, I mean, the common trend has been how in the past few years, the journalists have not only been attacked, but in general, there's been a muzzling of media, sometimes more directly, sometimes more kind of in a subliminal or a more indirect manner. And three major themes emerge from that. One is, of course, the rise of authoritarianism in South Asia, which is again not too different from what is happening in the rest of the world. So while we are dealing with one kind of pandemic and there's a vaccine now on the horizon, but this other kind of pandemic is pretty much growing and spreading. And I don't know when it sort of gets arrested or checked. So, and the second theme, of course, is the corporatization of media. So, which is again a very common issue. Once again, if we take the examples of the advanced countries, including the US itself, where now 5 major companies control nearly 90% of media that we consume, especially in the broadcast domain. And the third is, of course, has to do with the emergence of vigilante groups that may or may not be directly linked to the government of the day or the state agencies. But in general, they also target, in the first instance, those who are reporting and those who are speaking up. So, if we were to look at some of the most recent indicators, and I'll cite the Economist's Intelligence Unit's Index of Democracy, which I've been just reading in the past few days. So it's most recent kind of survey that I have in front. So despite the issues with its methodology and the way it frames what democracy constitutes or not, we see that India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, all three have faced some measure of decline in democracy, with Bangladesh, Pakistan, Bhutan. Clearly, they have been labeled as hybrid regimes, while India and Sri Lanka have been called the flawed democracies, along with the United States, Belgium, Brazil, and France as well. So, in that sense, it is not surprising that we have seen the kind of attacks on journalists in recent years. And in particular, the recent report of Reporters Without Borders that basically ranks different countries of the world along, using different indicators, and assesses the freedom of the press. Basically, their report on 2020 report was pretty damning for the South Asian countries. In fact, it identified Bangladesh as the most dangerous of the countries in South Asia for journalists, followed by India and Pakistan. And the three countries are at the bottom of the 180 countries that constitute the index. And Bangladesh has been declining in the ranking since 2016, when the ruling party, their Awami League, and its Prime Minister leader Sheikh Hasina Wajid have been brutally controlling the media, especially since the last election. The arrests of violent and violent attacks on journalists are routine. Two major newspapers were banned last year, and at least 10 journalists were attacked for reporting in the municipal elections. And if I may add that, this is what we generally think of media freedoms and freedom of the press in the traditional media, but Bangladesh has also taken the lead in punishing people for writing posts on their Facebook. So, a good number of people are behind the bars or facing prosecutions just because they dare to criticize the prime minister or the ruling party, or some such other crime, quote unquote. And similarly, in India, the situation is not too different, where the ruling BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, which also has a authoritarian streak and a very hyper-nationalist message and mode of governance for the masses, has been doing the same with the media. So, for example, the most stark example that comes to mind is the situation in the state of Jammu and Kashmir, which is now formally a part of Indian territory. Earlier, it had a separate status, and for hundreds of days and many weeks, there was a complete curfew and blockade of information. There was no internet. Many of the local papers were either shut down. Journalists were not allowed to report on the protests against the integration or quote unquote annexation of this region into the mainland India. And the siege actually continues because the level of internet there is 2G or something like that. I mean, if you were to look at in more detail, you'll find out that it's very difficult for journalists to operate. But not just the journalists. During the pandemic, there was a crisis of online education as well. And similarly, but that's just one most sort of glaring example that I'm citing. Even otherwise, in the other parts of India, especially in the Uttar Pradesh, which is one of the largest and most populous states of India, journalists have been at the receiving end. I mean, very senior editors have been booked on in cases. Most recently, a good number of very prominent journalists were booked in a police case for basically supporting the farmers protest which is ongoing, or reporting about it, or or refusing to toe the official line on those protests. So, and in Pakistan, I mean, which is a country where both Awais and I come from, the situation has become even more compounded due to what is now known as the emergence of a hybrid regime since the 2018 election, where there is a parliament and ostensibly a civilian government, but the military is very much part of the everyday governance as well. And once again, one of the key tactics of this hybrid regime has been to muzzle freedom of the press. This in the second thing that I mentioned, corporatization. Now, corporatization per se, I mean, people can have different ideas about it. Some say it's not all that bad, or some say it's, but the concentration of media ownership, and in particular its nexus with big business, and big businesses sort of um, unholy alliance with the ruling party or the state authorities has led to a most unique situation where you have on the face of it a very noisy, vibrant, diverse media scene. But what they present on television screens, or what the equivalent of cable TV in the US, is pretty much the official line when it comes to national security, foreign policy, or in the case of India, the kind of issues of caste that Kailash just presented, or in the case of Pakistan, the state of ethnic and religious minorities. So in general, that media has become more and more an instrument, and this is the so-called private and free and independent media. It's not the state-run or public broadcasting networks. And that is happening because of this increased convergence of the interests of business groups that own. So they keep on buying smaller papers, smaller TV channels, and concentrate. So in India, I think more than half of media, broadcast media, is controlled by one business group. I mean, it is it is mind-boggling. And in Pakistan, this concentration had started long way before this hybrid regime, when media was privatized. But when the cross ownership was allowed, where the big newspaper giants were allowed to set up their TV channels, and then and they haven't allowed many others to flourish in that market, because they have turned into an oligopolistic structure. And adding to that is also the kind of instrument that in Pakistan is more in evidence, and to some degree in Bangladesh and India too, has to do with the state advertising. Government advertising is still a big source for local newspapers, for regional newspapers to survive. And one of the key instruments with the governments has been to play around with that advertising, thereby punishing and squeezing media outlets or newspapers that are critical of the government, and while favoring those who are going to promote the government narrative. And it's, again, a common theme which is ongoing. The third point that I made earlier in my opening remarks had to do with the rise of private militias, interest groups, vigilante groups, which are either allied to mainstream political parties, or are tacitly or sometimes overtly supported by the government of the day. Again, in all three countries, you would, if you were to Google either the case in India or Pakistan or Bangladesh, you would see that, one wing affiliated with this political party attacked this journalist, or stopped him or her from reporting, or threatened them if they were to report against them or about them. unless it was favorable. And sadly, journalists have had no such security or guarantee from the state on their protection and safety. And that is a great, I mean, a more cynical instrument, not only leading to self-censorship, but also to a state of physical insecurity for many journalists. So, for example, I think the Committee to Protect Journalists, which constantly documents all such attacks. I mean, in 2018, 6 reporters were murdered in India in 2018. In Pakistan, particularly in the remote or, the peripheral regions of Northwest of the country bordering Afghanistan, or the southern province of Balochistan. Often journalists are killed or attacked, and they don't even make news for some time. And even if they make news, it's kind of ignored. And so there's a picking on Kailash's earlier framework. There's even a hierarchy within the journalists, who is more important to be highlighted as a case of muzzling of freedom and who is not. So, there are cases which are never pursued. So in Pakistan's case, while hundreds of journalists have been murdered in the last 2 decades, I mean, rarely has anyone been prosecuted. I mean, there was only one case in Karachi where that was linked to a political party's urban urban gang, which was prosecuted, and the killers were finally brought to justice. But other than that, there's a state, this culture of impunity goes on. And you must have also heard about the recent acquittal of the persons who were allegedly involved in the murder of American journalist Daniel Pearl. And first the prosecution made such a weak case that the courts had no option but to first let them off, and then they acquitted them, and now the government has taken them back in custody. But that's not going to lead to any kind of substantive outcome in terms of justice. So this culture of impunity actually marks, again, it's a regional virus or a regional trend. I mean, it's not no one particular country can be highlighted these days. I mean, there was a time when India had a better kind of both reputation and practice of some measure of democratic freedoms, notwithstanding the long-standing caste divisions that Kailash alluded to and earlier. But of late, in the past 5-6 years, they have drastically declined, thereby leaving a very dangerous and a very difficult phase in South Asian history. And that obviously has a huge impact on not just journalism, but also in terms of TV and film, in terms of what kind of films are being made, or what kind of films can be shown or banned. Yesterday, I think Rihanna tweeted about the farmers' protest, and the Indian celebrities were up in arms as to how come this rich foreigner has been bribed by the protesting farmers to tweet in their favor. And today, Delhi police is inquiring, has opened an inquiry against Greta Thunberg, who's a young climate activist, for apparently leaking some kind of document which has shaken the Indian security at home. I mean, such flimsy things you read and hear. And in Pakistan as well, I mean, the censorship is across, the spectrum. We had the most recent film made by a very young, talented filmmaker was not allowed to be shown in the country because it talked about the blasphemy laws and showed religious clerics in a negative light. And ironically, that film has been sent to Oscars as Pakistan's nomination. So while it will compete against other foreign films for Oscars, but Pakistanis at home cannot watch it. So there's this kind of, censorship in the name of religion, in the name of national security, in the name of defense, in the name of territorial integrity, in the name of nationalism. I mean, it has become this really a strange melting pot of both self-censorship and direct levers of censorship that the states are employing. So I think I'll end here because I may have taken more time than allotted, but hopefully I can continue to speak about these themes when we come to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Raza. I think you have given a good overview, but you have left very little for me to speak about, because that is what I study as well. I make cross-national comparisons. I look at how the situation is in India. So some of the points that I was going to talk about, you have spoken about that earlier, but I will just quickly, let me share my screen and then we can talk about it. Okay, hopefully it is visible to all of you. Okay, good. So when I make these comparisons and I look at the situation in South Asia, national security is what I specifically look at. That was the topic of my PhD dissertation as well. So I have been looking at what is happening in South Asia, particularly in the last few years with regards to the regime change in Pakistan and in India, and similarly in other countries. So Raza mentioned what is going on in India and Pakistan. So that's a good segue to show you these images. The image on the left, as you can see, is from the farmers' protest in India. And as you can see that it's an indigenous movement, farmers are protesting some policies, but the Indian government is treating it as anti-national, trying to use all sorts of curbs, including more recently, just yesterday, disconnecting the internet in and around the capital, Delhi, so that in an attempt to try and disband their rally or their contact with each other, so to speak. Similarly, as you can see here, in Pakistan, there is a Pashtun Tahaffuz movement that is going on, that is based out of the Northwestern Frontier Province. And because they are challenging the national security narrative that the state has, so they are considered anti-national, and two of their members who are actually part of the parliament were arrested on accusations for being anti-national. And the framing, you will see the images I'm showing here are from CNN in India and by Reuters in Pakistan, but the framing you will see within the country by the media organizations is very partisan, very much in line with what the state narrative is, and these protests are shown as anti-national, as challenging the very foundations and sovereignty of the country, be it India and Pakistan, and that there are quite a few alternative media organizations in both countries. But then if those organizations try to incorporate the alternative point of view, even those are considered anti-national. Raza also mentioned Rehana's tweet, and you can see it here. Same was the case with Greta Thunberg's tweet. So just because they tweeted in favor of the farmers in India, they are suddenly a foreign agent or funded by Pakistan or something like that. And same is the case in Pakistan, where the protest movement launched by opposition against the sitting government, which prides in calling itself the hybrid regime, when the opposition parties protest the hybrid nature of the government, they are called anti-national and funded by the enemy countries and so on and so forth, right from the prime minister to his cabinet. And you can see one of the cabinet members here. So that's the reality that journalists in South Asia are living with. And it is because India and Pakistan somehow dominate the journalism industry. Majority of the population in the region, at least 90% of South Asian population is concentrated in those two countries. So obviously they dominate the media landscape as well. But situation is not very different in other countries as well. Like Raza mentioned, the situation in Bangladesh, the protests are being dealt with by the government in a similar manner in Bangladesh as well. So I tried to find out what are the common themes in these countries, and why is the situation the way we are seeing it. So why is it important to look at what is going on with the journalists and the journalism industry in South Asia? Well, South Asian region is 20% of the global population. 30% of the population is below the poverty line. The region is more than 60% rural and has low literacy numbers other than Sri Lanka and Maldives, which are relatively smaller countries. Similarly, all 8 countries in South Asia consistently rank low on press freedom indices, and there is other than, of course, Bhutan and Maldives, which in the last report have made a considerable jump, the 2019 report, but that's after the regime change and the promises that they have made. But we are yet to see any concrete steps being taken for the improvement of the situation there. At this conference a couple of years ago, I made a case that these press freedom indices are directly connected to the human development indices in these countries. So if you see at the countries which rank higher on the press freedom indices, they rank higher on the human development indices as well, and vice versa, which is the case in almost all the South Asian countries. Because literacy is low, so newspaper readership is low as well, other than India, where newspapers are still flourishing, although the numbers, the audience numbers are not as high as television in all these countries, because to watch television in your native language, you don't need literacy skills as such, and it is 24/7, and it is considerably cheaper than buying a newspaper every day. But that national security narrative permeates the entire media spectrum in all these countries. The advent of digital media platforms had provided a hope for alternative voices and independent reporting, but there are a couple of problems that have hampered that hope, so to speak. One is, of course, the digital divide. The penetration of digital platforms is very low in these countries, although it has picked up in the last 5-6 years. It has almost tripled in India. It has almost gone 3-4 times in Pakistan and other countries, but it is still close to 30% or less. In Afghanistan, it is even dismal. So that's the reason because of which, even if there is presence of the alternative viewpoint, it does not reach the baseline as such. So to talk about the issues that are common in South Asia. Like I said, one is the national security narrative. And that national security narrative kind of because of the ownership structures and cross-media ownership, the owners of these privately held media organizations are happy to play along. Because it protects their business interests, and they are happy to toe the line of the government. And the nexus we see, for example, in India, ever since the current ruling party, BJP, came into power, we have seen the ownership structures in major media organizations change. The movers and shakers of BJP who finance their government, big media houses in India, they have bought major stakes in these major media organizations, and any criticism of the sitting government is very easily muzzled. Same is the case with Pakistan, where the role of sensitive agencies, the military, and far right is such that together with the government, they are the kind of pressure groups that prevent independent voices from getting a platform in mainstream media. There is no concept of training or job security. There have been massive layoffs both in India and Pakistan during the last couple of years, and COVID-19 has actually expedited that and given these media owners an option to lay off staff that they don't want within the organization. So if you need to keep your job, you have to accept low salaries, non-payments, and you have to toe the line of the government or whatever the media owner wants you to do. There are considerable safety threats in the region. It is one of the deadliest regions for journalists anywhere in the world. Since 9/11, close to 200 journalists have lost their lives in the region. In Afghanistan, 2019 was the deadliest year ever since the war started. Maldives was the only country where no journalist was killed during 2019, but in all the other countries, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, which are the bigger countries in the region, situation is worse for the journalists when it comes to independently reporting on the power players, and those voices are being crushed not only in mainstream media, but also in the if they try to use alternative media or social media platforms. And the newer legislation that we are seeing in all these countries is targeted at muzzling the freedom of expression using social media platforms. So the future looks uncertain. The journalism industry in the region will continue to face the impact of COVID-19, at least for the next couple of years. We have also seen in India that journalists have been arrested for not reporting COVID-19 numbers the way the regional governments wanted. We have seen in Pakistan that journalists who challenged the state narrative on COVID-19 and how it was handling it were considered anti-national and foreign agents, consistent with the theme that we see in national security reporting. So the future is really uncertain, and that is why it is important for media practitioners and scholars everywhere to keep a spotlight on the region and see how things unfold from here. So that is where I will end, and we are happy to take any questions. Yes, so let me see if there are questions. So Kailash, I have a question for you, and question is from, and excuse me if I butchered the name, but it is from Sreyashi Mukherjee. It says, interesting policy point. How do we create a safer environment for Dalits to access government aid for skill, career, and social mobility without holding it as something that makes their ability questionable?
Right. Now, this is a very interesting question for a couple of reasons. One, we need to understand that the questioning of their ability comes from the upper caste. It's not a self-imposed one. And it is somewhat seen as that they got a free ride and did not have the skill to come in, which is certainly not true. I think the first way is to, yes, it has to be in policy, initially at least, till we reach a point. And if you can get the example from the 1970s, when the American press actually made a very conscious effort to ensure that there was racial diversity in and among newsrooms in America, and that has actually helped at least in the representation and making the newsrooms a little more diverse. Now, there was, even in the Indian context, one specific charter called the Taramani Charter, which was actually brought about by a few of the new digital age news websites who agreed to make their newsrooms slightly more, not only diverse in matters of caste, but also gender. And Taramani chapter was also actually signed by a few of these websites like the News Laundry, I think News Minute, which is a South Indian website. They did sign this charter, and but unfortunately, none of the mainstream media took it up. So it's still a challenge. The other challenge is, unfortunately, there is a very, very strong focus on merit and individual success, how it is based on merit, which falls in line with, I think, what Raza said about the corporatization of media, where they see it as any kind of social benefit given hampers either profits or the very working of the organization. And I think that certainly should change. So one, it should come up as a policy for media platforms across, and certainly charters like these will help. But just to add the final point, the communities themselves are also pushing within the digital media space. You have websites like Roundtable. There's a YouTube news line called Dalit Camera, who are actually making their presence felt, at least in the digital space, being completely aware of the constraints that digital faces. I think that's some space which has still been carved out. So a lot of work certainly is there till we reach a time where it is completely equal.
Thank you, Kailash. And I have a question for Raza Rumi here. Raza, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Absolutely.
Okay, so I have a couple of comments here for you. Pooja Ishpalani says, good point, and Thunberg still tweeted she stands united with the farmers despite the FIR, and Marianne says censorship is gaining ground in India in leaps and bounds to ridiculous levels. Thank you for speaking out about it, Raza. And the question actually is related to it. The question is, are there examples of the question is, what are key steps for media scholars to address the atmosphere of intimidation?
Yeah, that's well. Thank you very much for the comments. I've forgotten the names. I think, as Dr. Salim, your presentation very correctly identified some of the linkages between low human development, between the way national security, the idea of national security is abused to muzzle not only press freedoms, but in general democratic freedoms. I mean, that has been once again a common theme, and I did not want to go into that because of the paucity of time. Is that the South Asian states are inheritors of the British colonial state, which was constructed during the 19th century. Very brutal, a very extractive, anti-people, a state with an all-powerful steel frame that we call the Raj steel frame, which sadly persists and continues in one shape or another across this region. And I think that's one of the points that perhaps in many of the media studies is not explored enough. It has been explored, but not enough, because if you look at things to do with, I mean, in 1857, there was a mutiny within the military, which turned into a war of independence. It really depends on where you're coming from and what you want to call it. But anyway, the Indians just rose up against the British, the East India Company and its brutal policies. And immediately, once that rebellion was crushed, and the Great Britain directly annexed India and made it as part of its territories, the empire. A number of laws were introduced. So, for example, if you want to stage a play in any district, you have to go and actually get a permission. And that was partly done because in those days we didn't have, of course, newspapers or even fast mail or railways or whatever. So the street theater groups were the most effective mode and means of communication and communicating news, communicating ideas, communicating what is happening in one region or the other. And many of those laws still exist on the statute. The police and its organization in South Asia is directly linked to an 1861 law. You can imagine how outdated it is. It's more than nearly 150 years old colonial police structure. And obviously, all of that we are reading and seeing about, anybody who's protesting against a government policy or a bill or a law or a certain thing is anti-national. It's a very colonial thing to do. That any native, quote unquote, who dares to challenge those in authority is a threat to the security and the integrity of the empire. And so I guess that's one point I would like to raise here, is that how far, and then there are numerous laws which can be used anytime against individuals, against media outlets, against media associations, networks, and then of course some of the other variables like caste or ethnic division or religious discrimination. They all come into it. I mean, it's not too different actually from what happens in the US with regard to race, where you have overwhelmingly white newsrooms, you have overwhelmingly white reporters, white editors, and and sometimes they end up speaking on behalf of Black and brown people, and obviously with the lack of representation, and that is precisely what is in a much more problematic way exists in South Asia, or in all countries, where people in the core undertake the task of speaking for those in the peripheral margins, and then they twist and present a particular set of information or analysis or commentary or whatever, which is very much either a statist view or a particularly partisan political take on the situation. Now in India, we are witnessing the rise of religious nationalism, not too different from what Pakistan had done earlier through its history, created a whole construct of Islamic or Muslim majority nationalism. And now, the Hindu majority nationalism is being experimented with in India. So even people who challenge that in their columns or in their little videos, or comedians, I mean, there's a stand-up comedian who is still in jail, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, I've been following every day, and he did not even make any offensive remark or anything of that sort, but a vigilante group arrested him the moment he landed where he was meant to perform, and said, well, you are likely to breach the national security or local peace or religious harmony, and therefore you have to be arrested and put behind bars. So I, earlier in my short presentation, I did talk about other forms of media production, like films and like television and other cultural production instruments. I mean, even there, this is an all-pervasive. I mean, you have to view this in the context of this nationalistic fervor that we are experiencing in South Asian polities. And unfortunately, it gets intensified with characters such as Trump, because what Trump called the media, quote unquote, the enemy of the people, fake news, quote unquote, that's a popular. So in Pakistan, the ruling party and its trolls, they are at the forefront of labeling any news item which goes against the ruling party's interest or its image as fake news. I mean, it's like almost a Trumpist world we are living in, Orwellian world turned Trumpist world. I mean, it's quite a fall though. And media and media production is seen as some kind of an anti-people activity. And there are open calls to shut down media. I mean, these are like actually aired ironically on television. It's time to fix the media. It's time to shut them down. It's time to shut Twitter. It's time to shut down the Facebook. I mean, with all the problems of tech companies, which we are familiar with, and that's a different story. I mean, these calls are more geared towards a kind of a narrative control in favor of a nationalistic or hyper-nationalistic environment and framing of identity, of politics, and of course of journalism to begin with. So what are the steps that can be, I think the positive side is that a lot of independent media outlets have emerged. In India, some of the leading crusaders are now not in the traditional media form, but The Wire, for example, it's an online portal with a lot of reporting and video production. The Scroll India is another example. And then you have many other smaller websites and web portals, and some of them are regional too, which are kind of filling in this void that has come through direct or indirect censorship and punishment of bigger journalists, or through squeezing of their finances. So a lot of local papers, at the district levels, are dependent on advertisements. So that's a great way to manipulate even local journalism. And a lot of murders in India in recent years that have taken place have not really taken place on any drastic thing, but regular reporting on government corruption, on corruption of politicians, on deforestation of land, of water, some of the issues that the indigenous communities in India and in Pakistan and in Bangladesh are fighting for. They're fighting for land, they're fighting for access to water resources, they're for livelihoods, etc. So I think some of that framework needs to be understood before something can be done about it better.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, it is easier said than done. And you have kind of answered this question about examples of organization that set standards for strong practices. So yes, there are organizations and they are trying, but they don't have as much money behind them to support such independent journalism. And like I had mentioned earlier, Raza Rumi, who is running Nyador in Pakistan, or Kailash, like you mentioned, News Laundry, that has recently been taken to court by the Times Group. And so these organizations face pressures of their own kind only because of the kind of work that they are doing. So we are coming towards the end of this session. So I have two questions for you, Kailash, and if I can combine them and you can just answer them quickly, and then we will wrap up. So the question from Sneha is, how would you encourage more Dalit journalists to be employed in media houses and increase that 5% Oxfam figure? And the second question is kind of related to that as well. How can social media contribute to opening and informing a public debate on discrimination and social exclusion?
Okay, both great questions. But just before I get to that, I think I would want to quickly comment on Raza's point, where he made the point of, both in Pakistan and India, the government support for newspapers and media. And just a few hours ago, I was talking to a friend who works in advertising, who told me that the Indian government actually spends more than Netflix for advertising. So the Netflix recently, started spending a lot on advertising for its popularity, and Indian government actually spends way more than Netflix. So you can imagine the kind of money which is being pumped to, and the individual and maybe the independent media might not have that kind of backing. But coming to the questions, certainly one way to encourage, is, I think, goes back to the fact that journalism, unfortunately, the way it is structured, most of them are profit-oriented, extremely corporatized. For it to be an even a slightly more attractive choice of work or career or vocation, there has to be significant changes, not just in the salaries which are given, which are horrible. I'm pretty sure even in Pakistan, the situation is pretty much the same, but also the environment itself. One certainly is, to make use of, consciously hire, and this is what newsrooms should consciously do, to hire more people. But unfortunately, coming back to the religious fundamentalism, which is also raising, automatically pushes any kind of such suggestions, back into the closet, because it is also seen as something going against national. Because the national image is of the upper caste Brahmin male. So anything which goes against, even with the fact of, hey, can we include more Dalits in journalists, or a critique from a Dalit journalist of the general situation, is seen as anti-national. So I think the fight is almost like threefold, where you're fighting not just religious fundamentalism, you're also fighting the caste system, and you're fighting the capitalist system which is running the media. So I think that is also where I think media scholars and practitioners can come together to find solutions for these things. How can we ensure a policy which includes a lot more? How can we make sure newsrooms are more diverse? And what was the second question? I'll quickly answer that too.
The second question was related to social media. How can social media contribute to opening up?
Right. I mean, social media does actually provide, although there's a lot of trash even on social media, it does also provide spaces for Dalit journalists to express a lot more freely and gain a lot more traction. and I can actually cite a few examples also. Recently, about a year ago, a BBC journalist who actually faced a lot of caste discrimination actually came to social media, and it got a lot of traction, and finally even BBC took actions, and it was in the Indian Hindi Bureau. So there has been times where social media acts as a space, but unfortunately, as we all know, it does create the bubble where any kind of little criticism becomes a direct target to trolls, where any healthy conversation or debate can, I don't think, can ever happen in the current situation. So social media might provide a small space, but it is structural change which we have to work towards to bring any change in those numbers of the Oxfam report. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kailash. Thank you, Raza. I think we have discussed the specifics and the generalities of the media in South Asia. And for me, the crux here is that the theme of the conference is journalism beyond borders. And the things we have discussed kind of allude to the fact that the power brokers in the region are trying to confine journalism into smaller spaces and trying to box it in. So in a way, it's a tug of war that is always ongoing, and we are at a crossroads, and it will be interesting to see how it pans out from here, particularly with the proliferation of digitization. So that, unfortunately, we are out of time. So that is where we will end. Thank you all for asking so many incisive questions, and for your presentations, and all of you who attended. Back to the studios, as we would say. Back to you, Vaibhav. Or should I just end the session?
John Mayo here again. I just want to express thanks to you, Awas, to Rasa and Kailash for an outstanding panel. You addressed, a most important and sobering situation in a comparative way, emphasizing the situation in India, Pakistan, and also the US. The fact is that journalism in these three countries, not only these three countries, journalists are being vilified and threatened. We certainly saw that in the last 4 years during the Trump administration. I think this is just the beginning of this topic, because I think it will be returned to in subsequent panels in the remainder of this conference. So I want to thank you especially for kind of setting a very high standard and providing a lot of very valuable information and food for thought. That will wind up this panel. We will reconvene at 11:45 for our next panel, on the subject of which is musical and performative communication beyond borders. So I invite you to return at that time, and thank you again for your outstanding presentations.
Thank you.